Hi, I'm John from the Christian Century. Welcome back. I'm joined today by former Christian Century intern Ginger Monroe. So it's good to see Ginger again. Recently, she reviewed for us the book Monsters by Claire Dederer. So we're going to be chatting about that book today and some of the ideas. But first, Ginger, for those who don't know you, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so like John said, my name is Ginger. I graduated last year from Boston University School of Theology with my Master of Theological Studies degree. And when I was there, I really took an interest in studying intersections between Christianity and pop culture. And right now, I am an admissions counselor at the University of Washington, Tacoma.
Very cool. Well, given your passion for Christianity and pop culture, this was a really good book for you to review, I think. Monsters by Claire Dederer, which explores what we do when we love art, but when the artist who makes it is problematic or even monstrous, perhaps. And so you dove into this in your review of the book, and you started, I thought it was really interesting with this story about how both you and your spin instructor were both kind of reckoning with your relationships with the music of Kanye West, a hip hop artist. Most people are probably familiar with who Kanye is, but some may not be. So can you tell us a little bit more about this dilemma that you experienced with Kanye's music and how you navigated it back like before you read this book?
Yeah, so before I read the book, I was not a huge Kanye West fan. Starting in high school, there were a few songs that I really liked and thought were good, but I wasn't super into his music or just hip hop music in general. So I feel like that's also an important starting place. And wearing my Taylor Swift Eras Tour t-shirt today because I thought that would be fitting because I also talk about Taylor Swift and the story. So also because I'm a fan of Taylor Swift, I had conflicting feelings about Kanye and her relationship and just didn't really like the way any of that was handled from the VMAs in 2009 to when Kanye and his ex-wife now, Kim Kardashian, leaked the doctored phone call with Taylor Swift before he put out a music video that was very derogatory against her, and I would argue women in general. And then just over the past few years, his behavior has escalated, and I found myself thinking, like, oh, if I'm at a party, should Kanye be on the playlist? And I decided before reading the book that he just needs to be done off the playlists. There's not really an acceptable context to enjoy the music. And if I ever did hear it and find myself kind of like bobbing my head, I'd be like, oh, Ginger, like, you need to not have as much fun listening to this music because he's a bad person. Um, and I hadn't really thought much about it again. I was just kind of done with his music until my spin instructor this summer brought up that she really enjoyed listening to his music and she is a Black woman and she just downloads it illegally. So that was a moment for me to reflect on positionality and my own cultural position, not being super into the music, being a white person and navigating it and thinking, maybe an illegal download is a good almost loophole to still enjoy music that's meaningful to you, but you have a gripe about the artist and you don't want to support them financially. Um, so that's kind of what got me started thinking about this in a new light, even before I read the book. And so I read the book and I thought, what a great place to start my review because I still had been thinking about this idea of, is it okay to enjoy it if you don't pay for it? Uh,
Yeah, that's what I love about this story is that your spin instructor is making a moral decision that the
mhm.
right thing to do is to illegally download music,
Yeah.
to steal music, basically. But it's a really interesting, I think, thing to ponder. Um, and you mentioned being a Taylor Swift fan. I have become a Swiftie recently at the urging of my wife. Um, I was dismayed. You mentioned briefly, I think you mentioned her carbon footprint in the review. So I was just like, oh no, don't make Taylor Swift problematic for me now, Ginger. Come on.
Yeah, so that's something I also really struggle with as a Swiftie. Every time I see, um, often on social media, different accounts that post celebrity or like billionaire fuel emissions, Taylor Swift's name is always near the top of that list. And I love her music. I've always loved her music. And every time I see that, it's like a dagger into my heart. And I can't explain why I feel so personally afflicted by this one multimillionaire's jet emissions. But then I find myself engaging in the discourse online of, oh, well, she needs to take a private jet for her own safety. Like, this is really the only way for her to get around, versus, okay, well, does she really need to be going to all of these places and having houses on different coasts and different continents? And
Mm. As
it
Swifties, we are now
overall,
required to jump in and
yeah.
defend her behavior.
Yeah, which I think is an interesting dynamic of being a fan, and Dederer kind of gets at in the beginning. She talks about the book as she wanted to start it as sort of an exploration of this moral dilemma, and she ends up realizing that what she's actually doing is writing a biography of the audience, of like fandoms, which I thought was really interesting because I love fan studies as well. Um, and how do we negotiate what is bad enough to make you stop listening to an artist? So for me, Kanye being disrespectful to Taylor Swift and then being anti-Semitic was just enough to sort of be like, okay, we're done. And the Taylor Swift stuff, I wasn't as serious about cutting him off because I was like, oh, this is just like a pop culture feud.
Yeah.
Uh,
And your feelings of how much you liked their art was also very different to
yeah.
begin with.
Yeah, it was also very different, and, I only like a handful of Kanye's songs, um, and yeah, I'm okay with not listening to them because
Yeah.
it's not
You
the
won't bob
majority
your
of
head to them at
it.
parties, we've learned.
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
I'll stand with my arms crossed.
That's right. Like a statue. Okay, I want to dive in more to the book, which you were telling us about just now, one of the big ideas of the book. Another one you mentioned in the review is a metaphor that
Mm,
you could think of the life or biography of an artist staining the art that they create. And this is one of Dieter's big points in the book is that depending on how much you loved the art to begin with, depending on how big of a stain you think that the life creates, you would then make the decision of whether or not to continue engaging with that art. I'm curious just what you thought of that metaphor and have you found that to be helpful?
yeah. So reading the book, I really liked the metaphor. I thought it was a really beautiful and I guess artistic way to describe what was going on here, and it sort of pulled at my heartstrings a little bit because you imagine you get this quilt from a loved one, like a family member makes it and gives it to you. You've had it your whole life. So I was thinking, okay, this is like my baby blanket, which is now like tattered to shreds, tied up and knots, but I still have kept it because the memory and nostalgia tied to it outweigh the physical condition. Um, or I guess the stain. And so to think about something I love that holds that much memory for me and not being able to separate with it and applying that to art that I love as well, I think is really helpful to say, like, oh, maybe we can view this in a new way. Like, I don't sleep with my baby blanket anymore, and it also doesn't see the washer and dryer anymore because I want to maintain its condition. Um, and so I think when looking at art, I have to remember that it's okay to sort of set it aside, but also acknowledge that there is a glaring flaw in it. So one of the artists she talks about is Picasso, which I didn't know this about Picasso before I read the book. And I am a person who really likes Picasso's art when I go to museums. And so learning what I learned about Picasso and his womanizing ways and just abuse of young women as like the muses for his art will now, like, for one, shape the way I interpret the art. And I think Picasso is maybe an easier way to understand it because it's not as easy to access as like streaming music on Spotify. I have to go to a museum and consciously decide whether or not I'm going to step foot in the Picasso room or just avert my eyes if I'm boycotting Picasso. Whereas I feel like I can acknowledge the stain on Picasso's art while still looking at it and thinking this art came at a cost of like a young woman losing her life because of a relationship with this artist, and that's tragic. And still there's a beautiful painting in front of me, and how do I feel all of those things at the same time?
Mm. Wow. Yeah. Well, in the end of the review, it seems like while there are many good things in this Monsters book by Dederer, there's not a lot in the way of guidance. She kind of leaves it up to the reader. You just have to wrestle with each piece of art, with each artist. You have to come to your own decision that you can live with. You expressed maybe a little bit of dissatisfaction in the review about the way that it ended. I wonder now that a little time has passed since you first read the book, if anything has changed about either your feelings about that or how you approach art and which art to engage with.
Yeah. I think I still feel the same way, which I think is more so because I feel a moral tension within myself. And so my tendency is to want to put that and externalize it and have someone else make the hard choices for me. So I picked up the book hoping that Dederer would draw a line in the sand for me that would say anti-Semitism is not okay in an artist, so we're done with Kanye, but carbon emissions we can live with, so I can keep listening to Taylor Swift and feel okay about myself. And she has a line in there that I thought was kind of funny, but she said, "You'll have to find other ways to decide whether or not you're a good person besides the art you consume." And I think that is a powerful statement for one, but then I don't know, I still feel a sort of dissatisfaction because I'll be honest, when I see Kanye West in someone's Spotify Wrapped, there's judgment from my part of like, how are we still giving this man so much power in our society, which is kind of what Dieter points to, that the biggest problem is that we live in a culture that gives power to problematic people. Um, but then, so she puts that on our culture and capitalism and it being like an individualistic liberal tendency to say we can just boycott one artist and not have to deal with the overarching system. But then I also feel like putting it on me and saying it's just my decision is the same sort of like liberal logic of I can decide what I do and what I don't do, and it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of the world. And I don't know if it's just my like upbringing, my philosophy about the world, but I like to think that the things that I do matter in the grand scheme of things. So I struggle with it because I like to think that by not streaming Kanye's music, I'm making a positive impact in the world, but it's kind of hard to reconcile with the fact that maybe I'm not
Mm,
having as much of an impact as I would like to be.
yeah, I relate to a lot of these feelings you're describing. I remember quite a few years ago, two documentaries came out around the same time about Michael Jackson and his survivors, where their voices were being shared of the alleged things that he did. And I continued to go out in public and hear his songs on every loop radio station. And I was just like, how are we still listening to this guy's music? I can't believe this. But the footprint of his music on culture, on music, the music industry itself was so much bigger than say like an R. Kelly, that it's like you can't just cancel someone the same way when they've revolutionized music as we know it. So I don't know. I've been thinking about this a lot the last few years, and your review made me want to pick up this book and see what one cultural critic has to say.
Yeah. So can I ask you, John, what how do you feel about listening to Kanye's music?
Wow. For the first time in a Christian Century interview, a question has been turned back to me. I, like you, I just never got on the Kanye like bandwagon early in his career. So I've never followed his music closely. I've gotten a little more into hip hop, I will say the last few years, but not Kanye specifically. So yeah, I have no desire, given the anti-Semitism especially, I have no desire to like start listening to his music now.
Mhm.
So that's my quick take on Kanye West. Thanks for asking that.
Yeah.
Um, there's probably so much more we could say, but thank you, Ginger, for talking about this book and your review. Anyone out there, if you missed the review, there will be a link below in the video description where you can read Ginger's review of Monsters. There will also be a link where you can buy the book and another link if you'd like to connect with Ginger. The best way to do that on the internet is her LinkedIn page, so we'll have a link to that below as well. Thanks for chatting today, Ginger.
Yeah, thanks so much, John. It was good to see you again.
You too.